This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're joined in the studio by Will Hazelip, president of National Grid Ventures U.S., not to be confused with National Grid, which owns and operates power generation facilities throughout the Northeast. Thanks for making the time, Will.
My pleasure, Dave.
So over on Long Island, there has been some reporting about the potential for replacing half-century-old power plants that rely on fossil fuels with more efficient and greener power generation operations. At the same time, there's a discussion in Planet Albany right now about relaxing our emission reduction and green energy usage goals that are in statute or regulation. I'm curious, though, if there is no action as part of that conversation I just mentioned, can you still go forward on some of your replacement plans, which would still rely on fossil fuels for creating electricity, or do you need some sort of leeway when it comes to something like the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to advance the plans like on Long Island?
Yeah, let me start off with our plans for repowering, as we've been looking at it, have significant benefits. So by replacing the old existing steam power plants with new, modern, efficient combined cycle power plants on the existing site, we're able to produce power much more efficiently, which means it will lower the cost of wholesale electricity. It'll also reduce emissions and increase reliability.
On that reduction of wholesale electricity prices, how big of a change are we talking about? Is this something that's like 1 percentage point, and so we can come in here and say, hey, we're reducing prices, or is it something more meaningful in terms of trickling down to ratepayers?
Yeah, we don't have an exact figure, but we think it would be significant reduction in the wholesale power price really across the state, because really what happens today is the older, less efficient power plants set the price many hours of the year across the state. So by replacing that with new, modern, more efficient power generation, it will have a very positive impact on that wholesale power price.
And coming back to the regulatory landscape, do you need any changes to state laws or regulations to move forward with that vision, or can you do it based on your understanding of the status quo?
The way we've modeled it is in line with the state energy plan. Okay. So more renewables will come onto the system, and as that happens, even the new modern power plants will run less often. So the emissions trajectory is in line. And for us, by replacing power plants that run fairly frequently for their age and efficiency, it means immediate emissions reductions. So we see all these positive benefits that we really think line up quite well.
And what is the lifetime expectancy of some of these new plants? Because as you're aware, there are some goals in New York state law that would say this is the drop-dead timeline for this type of thing operating.
Sure. You know, what I always say is just because a power plant's there doesn't mean it has to run. So these power plants will be able to help us throughout that transition. And over time, as more renewables are added to the system, they'll just run less and less. Maybe it's down to 1 hour a year, but that 1 hour that it's needed.
And is there, though, a timeline that makes sense economically for you to make this type of investment? Do you say, hey, if we can get 10 years out of this, it makes sense, but boy, 20 years, and now this really is something we want to pursue, for example?
Yeah, what we've looked at is how long it's going to be necessary and how much it runs throughout that lifetime, but with renewables coming onto the system. So, you know, our view is that that transition will take place over a period of years, in line with what we've seen from the state energy plan. We also look at what we've seen or heard from the New York ISO, focusing on reliability. And we think all those things line up to really support doing something like this.
Well, as I mentioned at the top, National Grid Ventures is a different beast from National Grid, the regulated company that's actually, getting people the energy they need. And so as a result, there's also a different way to sort of pay for projects. So can you talk about how you go about funding something like a revamped power generation facility on Long Island?
Yeah, sure. For our investments, we typically look for long-term contracts with what we'd call an off-taker. So just a customer, that needs that power, the access to the power plant. For example, today, the existing power generation that we have, that's been around for decades, is under contract with the Long Island Power Authority. And so they use our power plants to help supply their needs.
What's been the experience of working with the Long Island Power Authority, given the tumult over their leadership and what they're even going to look like in the future? Has that caused any headaches for your operations, for example, or has it been relatively seamless?
For us, we have a great partnership with them. Even though it's a buyer-supplier type of relationship, we really have approached it as a partnership that goes back to 1998 when all this was put together. And so we've always had a great working relationship, which is absolutely necessary to ensure that we're able to keep the power flowing and supply Long Island customers.
And do you have any skin in the game, though, about what that entity looks like or who's at the top of it? Or is it all the same to you? It's just people are going to need power, and for the most part, it's not going to really impact your operations.
Yeah, we really try to focus on the fundamentals. The power plants we have today are absolutely necessary for maintaining reliability. Repowering and modernizing those power plants makes sense. And we know that the Long Island Power Authority, in whatever form they are, will support that mission.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you for listeners just joining us. This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Will Hazelip, president of National Grid Ventures U.S., which owns and operates power generation facilities throughout the Northeast. So right now, we're in this sort of weird period in New York's history where while we need big investments in infrastructure, whether it's transmission or generation, we also have this climate where people are complaining about costs, and politicians then have been responsive to that. The legislature, for example, says, we need moratoriums on rate cases, and, you can't spend anything. How does that complicate what you see as the need moving forward? I mean, are we making penny wise, pound foolish, or whatever the expression is, I think I reversed it, decisions right now, or do you think we're potentially making smart policy choices right now?
I have to say, the conversation today is very pragmatic when it comes to energy. The reality that we need reliable sources of energy. We need to focus on affordability. It's exactly the right conversation to be having. But hey, listen, these are complex issues, so we totally understand that there's lots of different considerations, lots of different viewpoints, and we need to continue to work through those. But when you just back up and look at it, we know that reliable energy supply, reliable electricity is absolutely critical for the communities, the homes, the businesses that we serve, that our assets go to supply. And so we know that at the end of the day, we'll be able to work through that and get to the right solutions.
You don't think, though, that this conversation about affordability, and especially when it comes to the regulated utilities and their rate cases, is potentially going to undercut the investment and long-term planning that we need to have right now?
Yeah, so I focus outside the regulated utilities, so I don't really have a comment on that. But what I would say
it'd be
is
cool
that,
if you did.
What I would say is that when we think about repowering and adding that new, modern, efficient power generation at our existing sites, it has that positive impact on affordability, which is one thing that one aspect that makes it so compelling.
So thinking about the broader regulatory landscape in New York over, say, the last decade, it could be described as flying by the seat of our pants, or maybe trying to build an airplane mid-flight and then deciding maybe we want a different airplane, and why can't we also paint the airplane at the same time? And, it shouldn't even be an airplane anymore. It should be a helicopter. What does that mean for your short and long-term planning? And is that analogy that I just did accurate, or do you see a steady hand at the helm and it's been just clear signs and indicators through that entire decade plus?
These are complex issues. We certainly believe that all of the above is the right approach.
Which is the focus now, which was not necessarily the focus a year ago, 2 years ago, when we were banning fracking, when we were passing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. But, I guess I'm curious about that long-term sort of schizophrenic approach, and if that causes headaches, or whether you're able to just sort of put your head in the sand and do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't call it that, but what we do is focus on the fundamentals. And like we've talked about, when you think about what a communities, what a businesses and homes need, they need reliable and affordable energy access. And so we really focus on that and help guide our decision making day to day to really focus on that North Star.
What about the issue of regional interconnectivity? Is that something that you see as an important emphasis moving forward? And if it is, how do we go about removing some of the barriers to that, as well as addressing the issue of, well, no, you pay for this, well, I'm going to pay this much, no, you pay for that much, you really are getting more of a benefit. How do you address all those moving parts?
Yeah, regional interconnectivity is always a good thing. Now I'll contradict what I just said, and it's much more helpful when there's extra supply to go around.
Sure.
So actually what we've seen recently is less supply coming from other regions. So while you want to be connected to other regions to allow for trading of energy supplies when it makes sense, you also need to make sure you have enough energy supply in your region.
In terms of power generation, you guys are also in the renewable space, and I'm curious, how much interest do you have in advancing more renewable generation in New York? And if you are going to go down that road, what challenges do you face there?
Yeah, I'd say, we think renewables are absolutely part of the equation, all of the above, and make a lot of sense in a lot of ways. We're focused on our existing power generation fleet, keeping it operating, maintaining it to be able to do that, and repowering the existing generating fleet where it makes sense to, again, bring prices down, increase reliability, and reduce emissions.
Is that answer a response to what makes economic sense? If there was a market out there for solar, for wind, for more battery focus, would you be leaning more into that?
Not necessarily.
No?
So that's really just about the business mix we have and where we want to focus our resources.
Well, what is it about National Grid Ventures that makes you want to focus on those other elements that aren't necessarily the renewable side of things?
Yeah, it's really about the fleet that we have today,
Mm-hmm.
the position that we've had for decades, serving Long Island through the Long Island Power Authority, making sure that there's reliable and affordable energy supplies for the island. So we see that as kind of our first responsibility to ensure that we continue to do that into the future.
So as I mentioned at the top, right now there's a debate in the context of the budget about the future of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and one potential outcome of that conversation is changing something like our methane emissions accounting. At the same time, we have the Public Service Commission, which is considering some of the timelines for some of our emission reduction and green energy goals. Is there anything that you'd like to see come out of either of those activities?
No, nothing specific. So,
How about generally?
Leave it to the legislators to.
You really don't
do
have a
their
wish
job.
list on either of those sides?
I certainly don't. Yeah.
That seems hard to believe.
No. I mean, like I said, we're focused on projects that we think make sense, that reduce emissions. So we see them very much as in line with the goals of the state, and leave it to the legislators to figure out what that looks like, and we'll be happy to comply.
So anything you are asking for from lawmakers or regulators while you're in Albany today, or is it just to see my smiling face?
It's always good to see your smiling face, but no, I'm just here talking about the benefits of repowering.
And have you found a receptive audience for that, whether it's in the legislature or in the second floor?
I got to say that the story really resonates because I think people recognize the need for reliability. We've had a lot of weather events over the past year. We've seen the increased reliance on the existing fleet, and so that need for reliability is quite clear. Also, the benefit of reduced wholesale electricity prices and reduced emissions is really resonating.
Well, we've been speaking with Will Hazelip. He's the president of National Grid Ventures U.S. and comes to Albany with the smallest wish list around. Will, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
And Dave, my pleasure.
And for more Capital Press Room content, visit capitalpressroom.org or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.